Why doing everything right still ends in burnout. Predictive Behavior Model. You can be responsible, disciplined, hardworking, and still burn out. That is what makes burnout confusing. Because when someone is doing everything right, burnout feels like it should not happen. It feels like the problem could be weakness, poor discipline, or not trying hard enough. But burnout does not always come from doing things wrong. Sometimes it comes from carrying too much for too long, without enough control or a clear path forward to sustain progress. And when that happens, the brain stops reading effort as progress. It starts reading effort as cost. That is the shift most people miss. The brain does not only care whether the goal matters, it also reads what the repeated pattern is costing you, the way you keep carrying effort, responsibility, and the load over time. It reads uncertainty. It reads emotional strain. It reads whether effort ever leads to a solution. If the cost to you stays high long enough, the brain starts reading the path as unsustainable. And once that happens, even meaningful effort can start triggering resistance. That is why burnout can happen to people who look like they are handling everything. They keep showing up. They keep solving problems. They keep meeting expectations. They keep carrying more. From the outside, it looks like strength. But underneath, the cost is more than their system can keep managing. That is where Predictive Behavior Model, or PBM, matters. PBM is not just about what a person is doing. It is about understanding what the brain is learning to predict and what needs to change. If the repeated pattern teaches the brain that effort means strain, that a solution stays out of reach, and that the load is never fully resolved, then eventually the pattern starts breaking down. Not because the person stopped caring, because the brain started putting up an unconscious protective barrier against a path that had become too costly to keep carrying. And this does not always happen consciously. It can happen as a natural protective response when the load becomes too much for the brain to carry. And that protection does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like hesitation. Sometimes it looks like numbness. Sometimes it looks like irritability, brain fog, low motivation, or emotional shutdown. That is why burnout gets misread. People think the answer is to push harder. But when the brain already reads the path as too costly, resistance begins to build, often without you realizing it. That means doing everything right on the surface can still fail underneath. You can have the right intentions, the right goals, the right work ethic. But if the repeated pattern keeps teaching the brain that progress leads to mental and emotional exhaustion, the brain will start resisting that path. That is not laziness. That is not failure. It is the brain responding to repeated overload. Burnout is not just about effort alone. It is also about what the brain has learned to predict, and the barrier that can form when it no longer sees a better path forward. If the brain starts expecting more strain tomorrow, more weight next week, and no real relief ahead, then even meaningful things can start feeling heavier. That is when a person can still be functioning on the outside, while internally starting to pull back from the path they are on. So what changes it? Not shame. Not demanding more from an already overloaded system. What changes it is changing what the brain keeps learning from the current path. That means working on more structure, more control, and a clearer path forward, with less of the repeated cost that keeps teaching the brain this path is too heavy to keep carrying. Because the goal is not just to keep pushing. It is to create a better path so the brain no longer sees it as a barrier, but as something that can be moved past to keep moving forward. Burnout does not always mean the goal is wrong. Sometimes it means the way the goal is being carried has become too costly and too unpredictable for too long. That matters. Because if the path is the real problem, then the answer is not always giving up. Sometimes the answer is creating a new path before it leads to exhaustion. That is when burnout starts making more sense. And that is also when change becomes possible. The better question is not, how do I push harder? It is, what has this path been teaching my brain to expect? And what needs to change so effort does not keep ending in exhaustion? That is where better patterns begin. Subscribe for more on burnout, resistance, and the patterns behind behavior through the predictive behavior model. If this pattern stands out to you, or there is another one you want explored, leave it in the comments.